So welcome everyone. My name is Dani Dilkes, and I'm excited to have so many folks joining us to take a slightly different angle on Gen AI and assessment today. In our session today, we're going to move away from the conversation on how Gen AI is going to break assessment and start thinking about if or how Gen AI might actually just be revealing assessment practices that are already broken. Throughout the presentation, there will be generative AI generated images. These were generated using ChatGPT 4.0. And in the image on my title slide here, there is a classroom with school children, separated desks with cameras on the ceiling and posters that read, "Always watching, stay honest." So hopefully that helps you get a bit of a sense for the tone for our presentation today. So our goals for today in this very short hour that we have together is to first set a baseline understanding of what generative AI does well and what it does poorly. And then using that understanding, start to examine what threat, and threat here is in quotation marks and italics, because we're going to decide whether or not it's really a threat, but examine what threat Gen AI poses to assessment practices. We'll discuss the hidden curriculum of assessment and consider what we're really protecting when we try and AI-proof our current assessment models. And then we'll brainstorm what opportunity Gen AI gives us to move away from traditional assessment models. So an invitation to engage. As we go through, I will describe images that are important. I'll provide alternatives for participation, and I'll explain terminology. There's not a lot of it here, but there's a couple of terms that we'll be using. If your access needs are not being met, if you need me to present differently, please just send me a note. Or if it's something that Christina or Yazzer can help with, they are wonderful moderators. We'll make sure that everyone's able to participate. You're welcome to participate aloud in the chat or silently. I will ask if you do choose to speak aloud, just say your name so everyone knows who's speaking, because sometimes it's hard to figure out who's talking in a conversation. And then finally, another part of the invitation is this presentation, I do take a strong critical stance. You might not agree with some of the things I'm going to say. You might not agree with some of my critiques on assessment. So I invite, in turn, your critiques and alternative opinions on how we're going to examine assessment. This is going to be a slightly interactive presentation, as much interactivity as we can have in an hour together. And we'll be using a tool called Jamboard, which is sadly in its final days. I am using it to its very end, but it will no longer be available starting in October. And so before we jump into the Gen AI conversation, I think it's really important that we have a collective understanding of what generative AI does well and what it does poorly. In order to use Jamboard, I'm going to share a link in the chat.
I just did.
Oh, thank you, Christina. I'm
when you shared it earlier.
Attention to the chat. And I'll do a quick orientation to Jamboard for folks who might not be familiar with it. So it is a whiteboard tool where people are able to post on the whiteboard. We'll be working on slide number 1. So if you click on the link that Christina shared, it should take you to our first slide. The first slide is split into 2 columns. The column on the left says, what does generative AI do well? The column on the right says, what does generative AI do poorly? And to contribute, today we'll be using Post-it notes. So in the menu that's available on the far left, there's an icon that looks like a Post-it note, or if you're accessing it through the text, it should be called Sticky Note. So if you're using a screen reader, it would be Sticky Note. If you click on that, there will be a pop-up that allows you to type a sticky note. You type in there. If you are a color person, you can change the color. That's not necessary, but I will make mine orange and then click save. What does tend to happen in Jamboard is sticky notes get stacked on top of each other. So to move your sticky note, you can click on it and then drag it to anywhere else on the canvas. So we're going to take 2-3 minutes to answer these 2 questions. Again, the questions are, what does generative AI do well? And what does generative AI do poorly? And if Jamboard just simply is not working for you, you're also welcome to type in the Zoom chat. Looks like our Jamboard is slowing down a bit. If you're still adding, please don't stop. But I'm going to go over some of the responses, and I'm going to start with the poorly side. And so what can generative AI do poorly? We have reason. Generative AI is not trained to think critically. It applies logic that are human constructed logic models, but it can't itself create logic. It's bad at convergent thinking when context is important. I find that a really interesting comment, and hope whoever shared that might bring it up in conversation as we move through these slides. Actual creativity and imagination. Yeah, so again, generative AI is not a tool for creativity. Humor, absolutely terrible at humor. I know a lot of people who are terrible at humor too, though. So accuracy, when accuracy is really important. I'm still waiting for an AI that can do my laundry and clean the cat box. That's probably an AI I could get behind. Give you suggestions for improving grammar, word choice, and punctuation, but the suggestions aren't always the best for a number of reasons. And give you credible sources. And then if we look at what does generative AI do well? Some of the research tools are really good. So elicit and consensus. It can do well summarizing documents that you give it. It can generate a lot of content quickly. And I think quickly is an operative word here, because the speed with which it does things, I think, is one of its big draws. Create lists and outlines quickly. Help in the search for new resources, perspectives, and framings for ideas that I'm newly investigating or revisiting. Summarize and synthesize from notes and other inputs. I tend to be too wordy, and it can brevify my emails well. Provide many sources, many times wrong, but at least it helps discover sources. And testing out an assignment for both categories here. Excellent. This was not a plant, but whoever put this is excellent for our topic today. One of the posts on this side, I actually am very curious about the divergent thinking as something that generative AI does well. And whoever posts that, I invite kind of more explanation around that, because I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on how it doesn't do this well. So I'm wondering if either now, if whoever posted this wants to share, or as we move through the conversation, I'd like to hear more about this. I'll pause with my invitation there, but there's no pressure if you don't wish to expand on that.
Hey, Dani,
David, please.
Put both of the troublesome sticky notes, the one about divergent thinking and the one about convergent thinking when context is important. Did you want me to talk about divergent thinking first, or?
Yeah, please. I'd love to hear what you're thinking with that.
Well, I teach creative problem solving courses for SUNY Buffalo State. Mm-hmm. And we show our students how to use AI tools to generate additional ideas for goals. And so the cool thing is you can, when you use the persona bot, you can tell ChatGPT or Claude or whichever tool you're using that you want your resource group to be Leonardo da Vinci, Jesus, Muhammad, Barack Obama. You pick whoever you want from history or fiction, or you can have a rainbow suggest ideas. It doesn't matter. And you get these remarkable contributions. You get, the tool generating all kinds of ideas. Now we give it real specific directions. We don't just say, give me ideas for this goal. We give it guidelines that we use when we teach our students divergent thinking. Like a lot of people, for instance, when they do brainstorming, they mix judgment with ideation, which is really a no-no. So we instruct the tool, don't tell all your imaginary resource people, do not judge, build off the ideas of others, and so forth.
Fascinating. So I think kind of part of the goal of our session today, David, is thinking about how to use Gen AI for that. And I think you've already hit the last slide, so you're ahead of the game. But that's the really interesting, is thinking about how you can get it to think as different people. I will invite, if folks are still adding to the board, to continue on, but I'm going to highlight some of the specific strengths of Gen AI that are potentially creating problems for assessment. So generative AI is very good at producing writing in specific genres, largely because it's a tool that's been designed to replicate patterns of human data. This is particularly true when we're talking about large language models. So GPT, for example, probably one of the most infamous Gen AI tools, which has been trained on huge data sets of human language to recognize patterns in language and replicate those patterns. Because of this, Gen AI is also good at generating ideas, and they're not necessarily new ideas or novel ideas, but they're combinations of ideas based on those data sets that it was trained on. As many people pointed out on the Jamboard, it's really good at summarizing information. It's also really good at manipulating language. So taking complex text and simplifying it, or taking verbose text and making it more concise. Or I think somebody used the word brevify, which great new word. It's really good at providing the most obvious or expected response to questions, largely because it looks at what in its data sets was the most common response to a query and will respond similarly. It's really good at speed, so responding to tasks quickly. This is one of the reasons why it's so dangerous, because people will start to use Gen AI to do something quickly instead of putting the possible necessary time into completing tasks. And then finally, generative AI can be really helpful for clarifying or providing basic understanding of complex topics. So again, that idea of taking complexity and simplifying it. These strengths are not the entirety of what we need to think about with Gen AI, but when we're thinking about assessment, these are the things that will probably create the most problems for our traditional assessment models. Which takes us back to our Jamboard. And we're going to move to our second slide and start thinking about, based on this understanding of Gen AI, what assignments will be most impacted by the use of Gen AI. So within the Jamboard, we'll want to move to the second slide. And in order to do so, at the top, there are navigation arrows that will, the one that you want is labeled next frame, or it's an arrow pointing to the right. And we'll move to slide 2 of 4. The other way to get there is if you click on expand frame bar, you can click on the second slide here, and that will take you to that slide. And we'll be using Post-it notes again to answer the question, what assignments will be most impacted by the use of Gen AI? We'll have another 2 to 3 minutes to answer this question. Thea asked, could you elaborate about what you mean by impact? I left it a little bit vague. So you could decide which ones will have the most negative impacts. They'll prevent student learning if they use Gen AI for it, but you might want to answer as a positive impact, and that the interpretation is up to you. I love the folks getting creative by adding stars and plus ones. All right, if you're still adding to the Jamboard, please don't stop, but I'm going to go over some of the responses that were here. So we're seeing an impact on assessments that focus on facts with right or wrong answers, writing code, and absolutely, I've spoken to a lot of folks who are in engineering or computer science about the impact on code writing. Definitely, there's a lot of concern there. Generic discussion prompts. I appreciate the use of the term generic. We will talk about that. Writing assignments, assessments from the identify and describe areas of Bloom's. And for folks who might not be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, I've pasted a link to a resource that I always find helpful in the chat. But essentially, it's cognitive levels of learning, from the easiest things like defining a term to the most difficult, like producing content or creating. Any writing assignment that some students use to ask ghostwriters to write for them. Yeah. And I think what's highlighted here is that Gen AI is not creating new cheating. It's just changing how students cheat. And we will talk about sort of cheating a little bit. Unscaffolded or non-sequenced writing assignments that also omit self-assessment and reflection, seeking feedback from in real life readers and annotations. Regarding what and why and how of sources sought, reviewed, included. Just need a second to process this one. So I think what I'm understanding here is that these are assignments where they're just focused on the product of writing and not the process of writing. But if somebody who added this wants to expand on it, I don't want to misinterpret the submission. So I'll leave the invitation open. Whoever added this, if you do want to expand, you're welcome to use the Zoom chat or raise your hand. Or if you don't wish to, that's fine too. End of each chapter of the textbook questions, yeah, which often are reading comprehension questions. Scientific writing, methods might be positively impacted, illicit, or consensus. Scientific writing introductions would be easier, with annotated bibliographies and summaries being easily generated. Scientific writing, I'm guessing somebody does a lot of work in scientific writing. Scientific writing results and discussions might be negatively impacted. Over-reliance on previous information invite too much bias. And then we see a lot of people who maybe aren't mad about annotated bibliographies being impacted. Fine art, photography, and music composition. I'm not sure if I missed any others. So does anyone want to add anything to sort of what you're thinking about here before we move into our next part of the presentation? The Jamboard is still open, so you're welcome to continue to contribute. But I have started thinking about sort of the impact of Gen AI on assessment. And I teach a course on open and distributed education, which I'm very fortunate in that course that I'm able to invite sort of a meta cognition, so a layer of students sort of critiquing the design of the course and things like emerging technologies and Gen AI. In that course, I have an assignment that 2 years ago I absolutely loved, in which students contributed to a timeline of innovations in education technology over the years. And they were asked to essentially create an encyclopedia entry explaining an education innovation, its impact, and whether or not it's sort of had a remaining impact on education today. I asked ChatGPT to do this assignment for me. And so here I've posted in ChatGPT my prompt that I give to students, which reads, for this activity, you'll choose an ed tech or open learning development or technology and summarize it. You may choose a chapter from Weller's 25 years of ed tech or choose another innovation, technology, or tool that interests you. You'll research the development and reflect on the implication for distributed or networked learning. Your reflection can be written or recorded, but should include. And then I give very specific guidelines on what pieces they need to include, which is a summary of the innovation, a discussion on how it impacted learning when it first emerged, a discussion on the long-term impact, and a reflection on their own experiences. ChatGPT gave me a pretty good response to most of the prompt. And it made me pause and think about why generative AI, a tool that essentially just replicates and creates sort of this generic output, was able to perform decently on this assessment. And it made me realize that in a lot of ways, this assignment didn't create space for my individual students. Any student could have submitted this answer and done okay on this assignment. So I've not created a place for students to express themselves, with the exception perhaps of the last part of the prompt, where I asked students to provide a reflection on their own experiences with the education technology. And so because generative AI does generic really, really well, when we design assignments and ask students to be generic, that's where we introduce the problem of Gen AI. And Yazard types in the chat that it did poorly on the reflections, and it did attempt a personal reflection. And that's where you sort of start to see the lack of humanity in Gen AI. So it just very generically says, in my experience with various LMS platforms, such as Brightspace and Moodle, they're highly effective in organizing and managing course content. There's no individuality in that part of the response. And so that piece of the assignment was perhaps a little bit more AI resistant. But again, the assignment as a whole failed, not necessarily because of Gen AI, but because I wasn't asking students to be anything beyond mediocre. So that's one of my examples. I've started putting my assignments into Gen AI to start to see these places where I'm asking students to just be the same as everyone else. And so returning to our slide, this raises two questions that I wanted to open to folks who are joining us, which are, first, what do our assessments really do? And second, why is Gen AI so good at them? So I will invite folks to either unmute and chat, type in the chat, type in the Zoom meeting chat, or just to think about this. But these are the two questions that sort of underlie the presentation today, is what do our assessments really do? What's the hidden curriculum of those assessments? And why is Gen AI so good at that? Any thoughts? So Christina types that her writing assignments just test the output, not the thinking that goes into them. Yeah. So a lot of product-based assignments are very susceptible to generative AI. To reflect on the different outputs, the AI versus the human written. Yeah, yes, sir. Veronica says, demonstrate regular and substantive interaction with students at the minimum necessary to avoid censor by our supervisors. It's often the answer. Alex writes, at an art school, our assessments are really about coaxing out and developing creativity in students. Most work isn't text-based. Gen AI isn't very good at that. I think that's very telling that when your assignments are focused on creativity and creative output, that's where these tools will fall. Give students a chance to tell us what we want to hear. Excellent. So this idea that a lot of our assignments, students are just trying to do the thing they think we expect of them. And that's another reason why a lot of our assignments are so susceptible to Gen AI. I will invite folks to continue typing in the chat, but I will also give you my answers to these questions. So what does assessment do? And there's a lot in kind of critical pedagogy discourse and conversations. There's a lot around this. But assessment very, very often functions as a tool for conformity, normativity, and convergence. So essentially functioning as a tool to create similarity among our students. And we see this in things like learning outcomes and backwards design, where before we ever meet our students in designing a course, we say every student is going to leave the course with this learning. And then we design the assessments and we design the learning activities and we design the course content assuming that if every student follows exactly the same path, they'll reach exactly the same goal. An assessment, especially standardized tests or standardized assessments, does exactly this. It moves every student, funnels them all into this idea of being the same. Rubrics are, and this is where some people might want to argue with me, another tool for this conformity, the sameness, because rubrics and standardized assessment through rubrics also forces certain structures around assessment. They do a lot of positive things in terms of ease and efficiency of assessment and helping set up student expectations, but they do constrain what students are able to do within assessment. A lot of these designs for assessment are also rooted in a positivist view or a modernist belief about what knowledge is. And so when we have standardized tests, when we have courses that are designed with a single pathway for every student, it's all based around this belief that knowledge is absolute, finite, and objective. That knowledge is something that exists out in the world, and that our educational models are designed to kind of stick that knowledge in students' heads. And so if our educational institutions and if our assessment models are built around this idea, generative AI is going to do a very good job of this. Because really, generative AI is a tool for convergent thinking. And now David might jump in here after I go through the slide and challenge me. But the way that Gen AI is trained, the way that it's built, is it functions as a pattern replicator. It basically just creates copies of everything it's been trained on. They're not exact copies, but they copy the patterns and the most common combinations of words, the most common syntax, and that's how Gen AI functions. And because of that, as you guys have pointed out in the Jamboard, Gen AI is really good at vague, generic, and average, because it's trying to produce the most likely thing that would resemble the human input it was trained on. And really, really importantly to understanding Gen AI is those data sets largely represent dominant knowledge. So they'll represent Euro-Western epistemological or knowledge traditions and bodies of knowledge, much more than other forms of knowledge. And so this is why Gen AI is so good at some of these assignments that really are designed to create similarity among our students, because that's what it does.
Dani?
Yeah.
I wouldn't disagree with anything that you have on your slide. The sticky note I put up on the earlier Jamboard added the phrase where context is important, because when we train our students on how to take personal goals or organizational goals through the creative problem-solving process, we tell them that the AI is not going to know about your experiences, your beliefs, your passions. It's not going to know about organizational priorities, organizational culture. In other words, it's not going to know the context. It's going to give you generic convergent responses.
So David, thank you for that clarification. I actually really appreciated your 2 Post-its because it immediately did the challenging of what I was presenting here. But I think when we get to our very last Jamboard activity, which is how can we use Gen AI to fix this, I think you'll already have some great ideas. So all of this leads me to ask the question that I think a lot of people, when they're expressing concern about Gen AI, are not really focusing on, which is when we're so concerned about the impact that generative AI is going to have on assessment, when we start getting fixated on AI proofing our assignments, what are we actually protecting? And this, I think, is a really important question that we do jump over, but we are protecting the banking model of education, which again is that idea that educators have all of this absolute finite knowledge and expertise, and their job is to give it to students. And so many of our assessment structures are built around this idea of what education is. And so when we're concerned about Gen AI, we are in some ways trying to protect that understanding of teaching. We're also protecting hegemonic or dominant knowledge and ways of knowing, because again, generative AI reproduces knowledge based on those patterns it was trained on, which largely are Euro-Western understandings of knowledge and discourse and bodies of knowledge. And finally, we're protecting normative education, which is education that is designed to create similarity among students. And this goes back to that same banking model of education, where if the purpose of education is to produce people who can help maintain society as it is today, then tools like Gen AI are going to impact assessment within those systems because it's just replicating. If our systems, our education systems are designed to replicate, then Gen AI is going to be not so great for them. And so the question that I wanted to pose in the session is, should we be protecting this? Or does this give us an opportunity to redefine what assessment is and how it functions? And I do want to quickly talk about the idea of cheating. I know there's a lot of sessions, I think this week, that have been on academic integrity. And I would argue that cheating is a symptom of those systems that are designed to create this like sense of normal and this similarity among students. So students are unlikely to take risks. They're unlikely to kind of do things differently when they understand normative competence as the goal of an assessment. And so normative competence, and this is defined in the notes in the slides, but normative competence is the ability to understand and apply the norms of a given social group. So if students believe that the purpose of education is to appear the same as everyone else in their classes, is to produce this expected answer for teachers, is to create that kind of generic output, then they're not going to take risks. Then they will be much more prone to use tools like generative AI to produce those answers because they're not being challenged. And second, performance avoidance behavior is increased significantly in situations where students have less power or autonomy. And so performance avoidance, it means refraining or not making an effort on a task because you're worried about failing or you're worried about embarrassment. And so when we have these assignments, again, that are designed for every student to sort of produce this average answer, this generic thing, like my example assignment, then students are not going to make much more of an effort than using Gen AI will afford them because there's no purpose, there's no reason to do this. I will catch up on the chat, but I'm going to move us into our next Jamboard activity first, which is the crux of our workshop today. And David's already started us on this conversation, so thank you, David. But thinking about all of this, I'm not saying that Gen AI is a problem. I think Gen AI actually helps reveal problems. But the question then becomes, how can we use it as a tool to subvert rather than reinforce normative assessment practices? So how can we use it to help students challenge this idea of every student needs to be the same? Challenge this idea of producing generic, replicated knowledge. And I'm going to give folks a bit more time for this to start thinking about it, but it is returning to our Jamboard. And this is on slide 3. So again, to move to slide 3, there are these back and forth arrows. You'll want to click on next frame or click on the expand frame bar and choose slide 3. And I'm going to give 5 minutes and then see how much is going into the slide. But the question again is, how can Gen AI help subvert rather than reinforce normative assessment practice? looks like our Jamboard has slowed down again, but if you are still adding, please continue. So rather than me reading these out, I will invite, if anyone added an idea here, folks to share their ideas. If you prefer not to, I will read them out. But I think there's a lot of really intriguing ways of still using generative AI, but in a way that's more equitable and more designed to help students develop those key critical thinking skills that blind use of Gen AI might not be helping them achieve. So does anyone want to share their ideas here or reflection on other ideas that you're seeing on the Jamboard?
I'll share, and this is Jenny, sorry. Not a totally new idea, because I think this came up in another session about having the AI write in different styles, which would give the students clear picture, and then they can compare and contrast. So why is this in that style, and what's that style, and how's that look? And coming up with different examples to give the students the ability to see that very clearly. Whereas, if you're trying to do that as a teacher, it's a lot of work to create that.
And it does that very, very well. I think there's, interestingly, some copyright issues tied up in it with certain authors arguing that ChatGPT, for example, shouldn't be able to write in the style of Stephen King. But it does it very well because of how it's trained. So I think that's a really good use of it. Anyone else want to share? Veronica asks in the chat, I wonder if it can further delineate different periods of an author's style. Right? I don't know. Why don't you try it out, Veronica? If you have an AI tool close at hand, or I could. Give me an author. An author that you'd be able to assess if it's doing it well or not. Micro story in style of early. Stephen King, but like Truck versus Dolores Claiborne. I don't know what most of that means.
Okay, like a sober Stephen King writes very differently than like an 80s Stephen King, if you understand what I'm saying. Cocaine was a feature.
Okay, in the early, when not using a substance. I have no idea what we'll expect here, but we will return to our actual activity in a second. How did it do, Veronica? It reads, Tom's phone buzzed on the nightstand, dragging him from a restless sleep. He squinted at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Screen displayed a name he hadn't seen in years, Jessica.
That's very good. I don't think it captured the spirit. I'm going to keep working on it.
Okay. All right, let's return to our Jamboard. If anyone else wanted to jump in, you can, but I will start reading these. So just because it exists, people are taking a closer look at how they are assessing. And I absolutely agree with the statement. I think one of the best things that generative AI has brought to us is forcing people to think about assessment and to think about the whys of assessment and to start to examine some of their assumptions around assessment. So I run a lot of workshops on generative AI. I think I used the term recently, generative AI fatigue. There's a lot of conversations about this. But this is the thing that we keep coming back to, is not how is it going to break the world, but how is it going to reveal where the world can be better? And I think that's a really powerful thing that Gen AI brings to us. We see it helps with content creation and gives students examples and perspectives that would be challenging for a teacher to do in a reasonable amount of time. And we talked about this already with the kind of comparative essays and writing in the style of Stephen King. Have the AI generate the output and have students create a rubric for grading it. And that helps again with that idea that we talked about with the slide of student autonomy. When you give them the power to critique, there's much more engagement in the process because they are suddenly not just those recipients of knowledge, they're part of the learning process. Show how repetitive Gen AI responses can be. For example, asking how to increase access or equitable practices for X and then Y and seeing similarity. Yeah, so developing, I think somewhere on here, somebody else wrote about developing, helping students develop AI literacy skills so they can critique, compare, evaluate, and synthesize the responses they're getting, especially if they use more than one bot. And I think this is really important, is the idea that we need to start to understand not just what these tools can do, but how these tools work. So that's why we started with what is Gen AI good and bad at, because our baseline of how we decide to use these and how we encourage use by students needs to start with what do they do? Like, how do they function? For personal reflection, might be able to do a spot the AI. What about the AI imagining a situation makes you feel that it is disingenuous, and how can it expand empathy? Great. And in my sessions, I talk a lot about the idea of the uncanny valley. It's not in the slides. Is anyone familiar with the concept of the uncanny valley when talking about AI? See 1 thumbs up. See 2 thumbs up. So the uncanny valley is this idea that machines, when they're trying to act human, don't quite get it right. And you can't necessarily put your finger on why. It's a little bit uncanny. It's a little bit unhuman. But it's this pervasive idea that anything that's generated by generative AI will always have this small sense of not quite being right. And so we talk about this a lot as well. Gen AI might create opportunities for students to identify examples and non-examples of accurate content using numerous models or artifacts. And I like the post that's all the way to the bottom right. It says, if subvert is meant deleteriously, students could certainly use AI tools to avoid steps many instructors believe go into producing a particular product. See slide 3. And I'm assuming see slide 3 refers to where I said I invite critique. But absolutely, students can use these tools, and tools that came before generative AI and tools that came after generative AI to subvert the learning process. And I think the goal and what I'm hoping to convey in this is our job is not necessarily to police the learning process, but to change the learning process so it becomes more meaningful for students. So yes, students are going to cheat using generative AI. I'm not saying otherwise, but I'm not sure that our focus should be on how to stop them. I'm going to end on, oh, I lost my slide here, hang on a provocation. So again, the goal of today was not really necessarily to think about how we can change our assessments specifically to be AI resistant, but starting to think about how generative AI, if it is doing well on our assignment, how it's revealing what might be wrong with our assignment design and our approach to assessment. So my provocation for you to kind of walk away with is threefold. If generative AI performs well in your assessments, consider how or does your assessment reproduce hegemonic knowledge tradition? How are you inviting students to just reproduce all of the bodies of knowledge and ways of thinking that came before? How or does your assessment promote convergence? So thinking again to that idea of creating a student body or creating students who are all the same. Does your assignment contribute to that? And if so, how? And then finally, as the last slide that we ended on, how can your assessment be redesigned to promote critical thinking, critique, and divergent thought patterns? And so using Gen AI to help first reveal those those issues with our assessment designs and those assumptions embedded in our assessment designs, and then potentially looking at how Gen AI could actually help you move away from those assessment models. And the last slide here just has our references. The very last thing on my reference slide is just gratitude towards all of the artists whose work, either knowingly or unknowingly, helped train the Gen AI model that I used to generate all of the images. But we are ending a little bit early, which I don't think has ever happened to me before because I am a chatty person. But I invite, if anyone has questions, comments, thoughts, I invite them now, or I appreciate everyone joining us. Meg, please go ahead. Oh, Meg, I saw your hand go up. Oh, okay. Well, thank you, everyone.
And thank you so much, Dani. This was really thought-provoking. I love just the sort of abstraction of what you were talking about. And I wrote down something like, it's not about how Gen AI will break the world, but about how Gen AI can show that the world could be better. Something like that, that really resonated with me. That struck me as great. So
thank you, Christina.
Appreciated that. And thanks to all of you for joining.